close your eyes and let the quiet of this night hold you gently. Tonight we travel to the ancient hills of Israel, to a valley where two armies stood waiting, and where one young shepherd boy changed everything. This is the story of David and the giant he was never supposed to defeat. To understand what happened in that valley, we must first understand the world David was born into. Israel was a nation chosen by God from the very beginning, from the days of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. God had set this people apart. He had called them his own. He had made a covenant with them, a promise sealed not in the customs of earthly kings, but in the very character of the Almighty himself. He would be their God. They would be his people. And no matter how many times they stumbled, no matter how many times they wandered, that promise remained, unbroken, unshakable, as sure as the sunrise. But Israel lived in a dangerous world. The land God had promised to Abraham's descendants was surrounded on all seas by peoples and kingdoms who did not know the name of the Lord. Kingdoms with armies and iron weapons and gods of their own making. And among all of these surrounding peoples, few were as feared, as battle-hardened, or as relentless as the Philistines. The Philistines were a warrior people. They had settled along the coastal plains to the west of Israel, a stretch of fertile lowland that pressed right up against the borders of God's people. They were organized, they were strong, and they were ambitious. For generations there had been conflict between them and Israel, skirmishes and raids, battles won and battles lost on both sides. The two peoples had lived in tension for as long as anyone could remember. And in the days of King Saul, Israel's first king, that ancient tension came to a head. Saul was a tall man, impressive by any measure. When the people of Israel had first asked God for a king, wanting to be like the nations around them, Saul was the one God permitted to be chosen. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else. He looked like a king. He was anointed as a king, and for a time he led as a king. But Saul had a weakness that his height could not hide, and his armor could not protect. He feared the opinions of men more than he trusted the voice of God. And that fear, quiet at first, almost invisible, would eventually cost him everything. It was in this climate, under this king, that the Philistines gathered their armies for war. The scripture tells us in the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel that the Philistines assembled their forces at Soko in Judah. They pitched their camp between Soko and Azekah in a place called Ephes-Dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered on the other side, camping in the valley of Elah, and there they stood, two armies on opposite hillsides, with a valley stretching out between them like an open wound in the earth. Neither side moved, and then the giant stepped forward. His name was Goliath. He came from Gath, one of the great Philistine cities. And when he walked out of the Philistine camp and into that valley, everything went quiet. The Scripture describes him with careful, deliberate detail, and it is worth letting those details settle into your mind slowly, because they tell you everything about why the army of Israel was afraid. Goliath stood 6 cubits and a span tall. By modern reckoning, that is somewhere between 9 and 10 feet in height. He was not simply a large man. He was something that seemed to belong to a different category of creature entirely. His armor alone was enough to break the spirit of any soldier who faced him. He wore a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed in a coat of bronze scale armor that weighed 5,000 shekels, roughly 125 pounds, just in the coat itself. He had bronze armor on his legs. A bronze javelin was slung across his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, massive, heavy, built for destruction, and the iron spearhead alone weighed 600 shekels. And walking ahead of him, carrying his enormous shield, was a dedicated shield bearer, because even the shield of Goliath was too much for one man to carry into battle alone. Think about that for a moment. This was a man who needed another soldier just to carry his shield, and this man, this mountain of iron and bronze and Philistine fury, walked out into the valley between the 2 camps and called out to the armies of Israel. His voice carried across that valley like thunder. He said, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And then he said the words that cut deepest of all. He said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." This was the ancient custom of single combat. Rather than 2 entire armies destroying each other, one champion from each side would meet in the valley. The outcome of their fight would determine the outcome of the war. It was brutal in its simplicity, and it required something that the army of Israel in that moment did not seem to have. It required someone willing to step forward. The Scripture says that when Saul and all the Israelites heard these words from Goliath, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The same words are used again when describing what happened on the 2nd day and the 3rd, because Goliath did not come out just once. He came out every morning and every evening. For 40 days he walked into that valley, and for 40 days he issued his challenge, and for 40 days the army of Israel stood on their hillside and did not move. 40 days. 40 mornings of hearing that voice echoing off the walls of the valley. 40 evenings of watching the sun go down without an answer. 40 days of a giant's laughter, settling into the bones of an entire army like cold water, until the fear was not just in their minds, but in their hands and their feet and their chests. No one moved. And then a shepherd boy arrived with bread and cheese for his brothers. His name was David. He was the youngest son of a man named Jesse from the town of Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons in total, and 3 of the oldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, were serving in Saul's army in the valley of Elah. David himself was too young to serve. His role at this point in the story was to tend his father's sheep. That was his world. The hills outside Bethlehem, the quiet of open pastures, the weight of a shepherd's staff in his hand, the sound of sheep moving across dry grass, the open sky above him, and the sense, the deep settled sense, that he was never entirely alone out there, because the God of Israel was with him. David knew that. Not as a distant theological idea, but as a living reality. He had experienced it in the fields. He had felt it in the moments of crisis that shepherding to sometimes brought. The lion that came after the flock, the bear that threatened the sheep. In those moments, David had not stood paralyzed. He had run toward the threat. He had grabbed the animal. He had struck it down. And afterward, he knew, with the kind of knowing that comes from experience rather than assumption, that it was the Lord who had delivered him. That kind of faith does not come from reading about God. It comes from walking with him through hard things. David had walked with God through hard things, and that walk had shaped him into something the army of Israel, in all its armor and organization, did not currently have. Someone who was not afraid. Jesse sent David to the camp with provisions, a measure of roasted grain, 10 loaves of bread, and 10 cuts of cheese for the commander of his brother's unit. It was a practical errand, unremarkable on its surface. A father sending his youngest boy to check on his older brothers and bring them food from home. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and set out for the valley of Elah. He arrived just as the army of Israel was going out to their battle positions. The 2 sides were forming their lines on opposite hillsides, the way they had done every day for 40 days. Soldiers calling to each other, the sounds of armor and weapons, the low murmur of men preparing themselves for something they hoped would not happen. David left his supplies with the supply keeper and ran into the battle lines to find his brothers. He was asking after them, making sure they were well, doing what his father had sent him to do, when the moment arrived. Goliath stepped out from the Philistine lines. He walked into the valley between the 2 camps, and he opened his mouth, and that voice, that enormous, contemptuous, crushing voice, rolled across the valley like it had every morning and every evening for 40 days. And the men of Israel fled from him. The scripture says they were dreadfully afraid. David stood among them and watched this happen, and something stirred in him, something that was not fear, something closer to bewilderment, and then quietly to righteous anger. He began asking questions. He turned to the men standing near him and said, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Notice that phrase, the living God, not an abstract deity, not a distant divine force, the living God, the one who was present, the one who heard, the one who acted. The men told him what the king had promised, that whoever killed Goliath would be given great riches, the king's own daughter in marriage, and his father's house would be made free in Israel. The reward was extraordinary, and yet for 40 days no one had stepped forward to claim it. David's oldest brother Eliab overheard him asking these questions, and he was angry. The way older brothers sometimes are when a younger sibling wanders somewhere they shouldn't be and starts acting like they understand things. Eliab said to David, "Why have you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. You have come down to see the battle. It is worth pausing here, because this moment is easy to miss in the rush of the larger story." Eliab saw David's questions as arrogance. He saw a boy who didn't belong, asking questions that were above his station. He reduced David to his role, the little brother, the sheep tender, the one who stood behind. And David's answer was quiet and simple. He said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause? Is there not a cause?" He turned away from his brother and kept asking his questions, and eventually word reached King Saul that there was a young man in the camp who was not afraid, and Saul sent for him. When David stood before Saul, the king looked at him the way Eliab had looked at him. He saw a boy, a young man, someone without the experience or the stature that a moment like this demanded. And Saul said to him gently but firmly, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." David did not argue with Saul's assessment of Goliath. He did not minimize the giant. He did not pretend the danger wasn't real. Instead, he told Saul about the fields. He said, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." And then he said something that is perhaps the most important line in the entire story. He said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." That is faith, real faith, not the absence of awareness of danger. David could see Goliath clearly, not the pretense of courage. David knew exactly what he was walking toward. Faith is the settled conviction that the God who has been faithful before will be faithful again. That the same hand that reached into the field and helped a shepherd boy fight off a lion will reach into this valley and help that same shepherd boy face something far larger. David had a history with God, and that history gave him a future he could trust. Saul looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "Go, and the Lord be with you." He tried to dress David in his own armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him in a coat of mail. He gave him his sword, and David tried to walk in it and could not. The armor was too heavy, too large, built for a different man. David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." And he took them off. Then he picked up his staff. He walked to a nearby stream, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the water, placing them carefully, one by one, into the pouch of his shepherd's bag. He took his sling in his hand, and he walked toward the giant. Goliath saw him coming from a distance, and when the giant realized what he was seeing, a boy, a staff, a sling, no armor, no sword, he was offended, genuinely, deeply offended. The scripture says he disdained David. He looked at him with contempt. He said, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And he cursed David by his gods. And then he said, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." It was meant to be the final word, the crushing dismissal of someone who had made a terrible mistake by wandering into a war that was none of his business. But David had a word of his own. He said, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Read those words again slowly. You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. That is the whole story right there. That is the whole theology of this moment compressed into a single contrast. Goliath came with weapons that could be weighed and measured and feared. David came with something that could not be measured at all: the name and the presence and the power of the living God. And then the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. And David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. He ran, not slowly, not hesitantly, not with the careful, reluctant steps of someone who has talked himself into something he's not sure about. He ran toward the giant, toward the valley, toward the thing that had paralyzed an entire army for 40 days. He put his hand in his bag and took out a stone. He slung it, and the stone sank into Goliath's forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. The scripture says it simply and plainly. No elaborate description of the impact, no dramatic slow-motion account, just the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell. David ran and stood over the Philistine. He took Goliath's own sword from its sheath and killed him with it and cut off his head. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Let this story rest with you for a moment before we say anything else about it. Because there is a temptation when we hear stories like this to hold them at arm's length, to admire them the way we admire a painting in a museum. Beautiful, impressive, but separated from us by glass and distance and centuries. We think, that was David. That was then. That was a specific moment in a specific valley with a specific giant. What does any of this have to do with me, lying here in the quiet of tonight? Everything. Every one of us has a valley of Elah. Every one of us has stood on a hillside across from something enormous, something that seemed invincible, something that had been speaking over us for days or weeks or years, and felt that specific paralysis that the story describes so honestly, that helplessness, that inner voice that says, who could possibly face this? Your Goliath may not be made of iron and bronze. It may be a medical diagnosis that arrived when you least expected it. It may be a relationship that is broken in ways that seem unfixable. It may be a financial situation that feels like a wall you cannot climb. It may be a grief so heavy it has changed the shape of how you move through each day. It may be an addiction or a wound from your past that keeps stepping out into the valley of your life and defying you, morning and evening, the way Goliath defied Israel. 40 days, 40 evenings, the same voice, the same challenge, the same sense that nothing is changing. The army of Israel was not made up of cowards. These were soldiers, trained men, men who had fought before and would fight again. But something about this particular giant, in this particular valley, at this particular moment, had gotten inside them in a way that their training and their experience could not answer. That happens to us too. There are things in life that our own strength, our own resources, our own best thinking simply cannot resolve. And the longer we stand across from them without moving, the larger they seem to grow. But notice what David brought to that valley. He did not bring superior training. He did not bring better armor. He did not bring a strategy that the military commanders had somehow overlooked. He brought a history, a personal, lived, tested history with a faithful God.